Hey YouTube, I've received a lot of objections against the papacy and I wanted to share my answers to them. I'm going to go right into it because it's kind of long. Um, isn't Jesus the rock and not St. Peter? Um, the proof of that for them is 1 Corinthians 10 verse 4, Acts 14 verse 12, and Ephesians 2 verse 20. Um, concerning verses like 1 Corinthians 10 verse 4, Jesus is the rock, but Peter is also the rock. It tells us that Jesus is the chief cornerstone. Jesus is the chief cornerstone. Back in the times of Christ, the chief cornerstone was the most important rock, because if the cornerstone was removed from the building, the whole building would collapse and fall. Jesus is the cornerstone of the church. If Jesus is removed from the church, the whole church will fall. Peter is the foundation upon which the church is built. The second objection, Jesus is the foundation. 1 Corinthians 3:11, Ephesians 2 verse 20, and 1 Peter 2 6 to 8. These verses are taken out of context. Paul was saying that Jesus was the foundation of the Christian faith, not the structure of the church. The difference is that the church, being the body of Christ, and faith is necessary to become a member of the church. Those are the differences. The next objection is, how could Peter be the leader of the apostles when Matthew 20, 20 verse 25 to 26 tells us there was no leader? Christ never said there was no leader. He said, whoever wishes to be great among you shall be your servant. This verse means that leaders need to be servants. Peter says in 1 Peter 5, 1 to 5, not to lord it over those assigned to you, but be example to the flock. Jesus himself said, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. The Pope is also referred to the servant of the servants of God. So he follows that example. The next objection, doesn't Luke 22, 24 to 32 tell us, none of them are greater than the other, this proving the role of the Pope is heretical? No, this passage means that the papal leadership should not be one of the arrogating power, but of the Christ-like service. The Pope, as I said before, is the servant of the servants of God, meaning his role is to care for the people of the Church of God. The next objection, if Peter was the first Pope, then why was Paul equal to Peter? As we see in 2 Corinthians 12 verse 11, actually I should have been commended by thee, for in no respect was I inferior to the most eminent apostles, even though I am a nobody. This verse is also taken out of context. It has nothing to do with Peter's primacy over the apostles. Paul wasn't inferior to the apostles in the works he did, example, his preaching and knowledge that they had. Let us consider 2 Corinthians 11, 5 to 6. It reads, I do not think I am in the least inferior to those super apostles. I may indeed be untrained as a speaker, but I do have knowledge. We have made this perfectly clear to you in every way. Paul was simply saying that he was a good preacher, just like the rest of the apostles, not that he was equal to them in authority. And on the contrary, we see that the apostles were bishops, but Paul considered himself a deacon. 1 Corinthians 3 verse 5, 1 Corinthians 4 verse 1, and so on and so on. Another objection. How can Peter be the leader of the church since Christ rebuked him and even called him Satan? Matthew 16 verse 23. How can he have primacy over the apostles if he was rebuked by Paul? Galatians 2 verse 11. Christ's rebuke of Peter does not mean he had no primacy over the apostles. Sometimes the Pope does need to be rebuked or corrected in a sense. In the end, Christ still told Peter to tend to his sheep. John 21 verse 15 and 17. Now Peter was not impeccable, meaning he was not without sin. He wasn't immaculate, and neither was his successors. Also, Paul's rebuke of Peter doesn't disprove Peter's premises. Um, if you actually read the verse, it says that Peter acted like a hypocrite. Peter said one thing but did the other. Paul rebuked Peter in his face for that. And if Peter's actions were rebuked and condemned, and his teachings weren't, there's no objection. Another objection. Didn't James have more authority than Peter at the Council of Jerusalem? Acts 15:13-21. No. This chapter only strengthens the notion that Peter was actually the leader. When it was James' turn to speak, notice how James makes a reference to Peter and Peter's judgment. James accepts what Peter declared, and then James elaborates on what Peter had said. Before Peter had spoken, we read that there was, quote, much debate, or in other translations, much disputing. But after Peter had rose up and made his declaration, all the multitude kept silence, or in other translations, the whole assembly fell silent. Let us also consider the fact that in Galatians 2:12 that we see certain men came from James, and these men had trouble accepting the Gentiles. But as we see in the book of Acts, James accepted the decree of Peter. Therefore, James's followers also accepted the decree of Peter. This chapter also shows that what the Catechism of the Catholic Church says is true, that, quote, the college or body of bishops, which in those days were James and the other apostles, has no authority unless united with the Roman pontiff, Peter's successor, as its head. The next objection. How could Peter be the leader of the apostles since he referred to the other apostles as his fellow elders? 1 Peter 5-11. Well, 4 verses after that, Peter says, clothe yourself in humility in your dealings with one another, for God opposes the proud, but bestows favor on the humble. So humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time. By referring to the apostles as his fellow elders, he practices the virtue of humility. Peter was the bishop of Rome, and the other apostles were bishops as well. We know that an elder is a bishop. The Pope, the successor to Peter, also refers to the cardinals and bishops as his fellow elders as well. The next objection. Didn't Jesus give the keys to the apostles? Tertullian, who is not an early church father, but who wrote and lived around the year 220 AD, had made a statement saying, I now inquire you into your opinion, to see whence you assert this right for the church. Do you presume, because the Lord said to Peter, on this rock I will build my church, I have given you the keys to the kingdom of heaven, or whatever you shall have bound or loosed in heaven, that the power of binding and loosing has thereby been handed on to you, that is, to every church akin to Peter? What kind of man are you, subverting and changing what was the manifest intent of the Lord when he conferred this personally unto Peter? On you, he says, I will build my church, and I will give you the keys, not to the church, and whatever you shall have bound or you have loosed, not what they shall have bound or what they have loosed. Another objection. Nowhere in the Bible does it say Peter was in Rome. Even if Peter was never in Rome, he still could have been Pope, first of all. Secondly, the Bible never said that Peter was in Rome, but it doesn't say Peter was not in Rome. Also, the Bible does make reference to Peter being in Babylon, which was a code name to Rome. And many of the early church fathers from the year 170 AD, like St. Irenaeus and St. Clement, all said that he was in Rome. And the last objection that I'll share. The church is often compared to the human body in the scriptures. The members of the church are represented at the various parts of the body. Christ is always said to be the head. What part of the body is the Pope? Also, How does one get the idea of a subhead in the body? Consider the words of St. Augustine. If the rulers of the church are shepherds, how is there one shepherd, except that all these are members of one shepherd? Remember that Christ calls Peter a shepherd, John 21, verse 15 to 17. Yet he calls himself the good shepherd, John chapter 10. St. Thomas Aquinas, Doctor of the Church, sums it up and answers this objection thoroughly. He says, it is written in Colossians 2 verse 19, the head of the church is that from which the whole body by joints and bands being supplied with nourishment and compacted groweth unto the increase of God. But this belongs only to Christ. Therefore Christ alone is head of the church. First, inasmuch as Christ is the head of all who pertains to the church in every place and time and state. But all other men are called heads with reference to certain special places, as bishops of their churches, or with reference to a determined time as the Pope is the head of the whole church during the time of his pontificate, and with reference to a determined state, inasmuch as they are in the state of wayfarers. Secondly, because Christ is the head of the church by his own power and authority, while others are called heads as taking Christ's place, according to 2 Corinthians 2 verse 10. For what have I pardoned, if I have pardoned anything? For your sakes I have done it in the person of Christ. And 2 Corinthians 5 verse 20 says, for Christ therefore we are ambassadors, God as it were exhorting by us. So likewise others may be called foundations and heads, inasmuch as they are members of the one head and one foundation. So these are my answers to those common objections that were given to me. If you have any more objections to the papacy, I want to know them. Comment on this video the full objection and your reasons. If you're Catholic or not, I want to know.